A key part of a cap and trade system is how you start the market, the initial allocation of permits. A popular method for doing so is grandparenting. And what happens here is that the government creates these permits and then gives them away for free to the emitters of greenhouse gases. And it typically does so proportional to emissions in the recent past. And that is why it used to be called grandfathering, because government acts as a kindly grandfather, gives away prezzies to the emitters, and it does so while looking to the past. But then people realize that grandfathers are just as bad in this regard. The main advantage of grandparenting is that it's politically easy. It used to be that you did not need a permit to emit your carbon dioxide, but now you do. So if you introduce those plans, there's a lot of lobbying against. And in order to sweeten the deal, the government gives away these permits for free, so nothing much changes. Grandparenting confirms the status quo. It does not upset the apple cart. Now this may sound also fair, but it is in fact not. Because if emission permits are allocated based on emissions in the recent past, but emission permits are needed for the near future, you don't need permits for what you did in the past, you need permits for what you do now and what you plan to do next year. If emission permits are allocated based on the recent past, then essentially you punish fast-growing companies, whereas slow-growing companies get an implicit subsidy relative to their competitors. Similarly, companies that reduce their emissions in the past relative to their output get a low allocation, whereas companies that did not clean up their output do not get a much higher allocation. So you punish good behavior in the past and you reward bad behavior in the past. So it's not an ideal system. Another problem with grandparenting is that the market starts without a price. You say, well, you should trade these permits, but then you give them away for free, and nobody knows in the beginning what the price of these permits would be. So an alternative system is to auction the permits. Government creates them and then essentially sells them to the highest bidder. A good thing here is that you start the market with a price. A good thing from the revenue from the treasury perspective is that you generate a lot of revenue. Bad thing from a polluter's perspective is that it generates a lot of revenue. People need to fork out a lot of money. So good things and bad things about this. What people have suggested is to combine the two, to give away most permits for free, so as to make the deal politically palatable, but keep something back and sell it in an auction, so then the market starts with a price, a hybrid between grandparenting and auctioning, and that seems to work just as well. If you auction all permits, then it's almost a cap and trade system is almost equal to a carbon tax. And the reason for that is as follows. The cap and trade system sets a price, just like a tax would, on emissions, and therefore a reward on emission reduction. And a tax generates revenue that flows from the emitters to the government, and auctioned permits do the same thing. So in that sense, cap and trade with auction is almost the same as a carbon tax. The big difference is that a tax is stable, doesn't vary much over time, whereas the price of emission permits can vary quite a lot within a year. But if you're not worried about price variability, then essentially the two systems are equivalent. Auction cap and trade and a tax are essentially equivalent. There's a third way of allocating the permits, and that is to give them to the victim. And recall, we're dealing with an externality here. An externality is an unintended and uncompensated unintended and uncompensated consequence for a third party, for an innocent bystander in the economic activity, in this case the economic activity of generating greenhouse gases. So it would be fair to say, well, if I want to emit CO2, I need to buy the permits from the people who suffer the consequences of my emissions. And if you do that, you essentially immediately compensate the victims of your pollution. Whereas if you use a carbon tax, then you compensate the government for your emissions. And if you use auction permits, you compensate the government again. And if you use grandparented permits, then essentially you compensate the last polluters in the past. That doesn't seem right. But if you give the permits, the initial permits, to the victims, you solve this problem. People may argue that this is the right thing to do. It is definitely a very complicated thing to do, because you would need to sort out who are the victims of climate change, and you need to have a robust measure of victimhood here. Most of these victims are actually people who in the future who have yet to be born, and that makes it even more complicated to allocate permits to them. You essentially would need to allocate permits to their would-be parents. So it's practically very, very difficult to do, because most of the impacts of climate change fall on poor countries. Most of the emissions from greenhouse gases are in rich countries. This would generate large transfers, and for that reason it's a political non-starter, because we would be told to give large amounts of money to essentially a very valuable piece of property to the people of Cameroon and the people of Bangladesh, and we would not be inclined to do so. The fourth way of allocating permits initially is to hand them out per capita. This has a basis in international law, which defines the atmosphere as the common property of humankind. Whereas if you, essentially what you do when you create a permit to emit, you essentially say, well, part of this property called the atmosphere, it now belongs to me, and the right to dump stuff in the atmosphere now belongs to me. It no longer is the common property of humankind. And if the government grandparents the permits, and essentially what the government says, the right to pollute is mine, no longer common property of humankind, it's government property, and then we give it to the polluters. Or if you auction it, then again it's the government that appropriates this right. And if you have a good government that you can trust, there is not much of an issue, but not all governments can be trusted. And some governments cannot be trusted any of the time, and there's also governments that can be, there's no government that can be trusted all of the time. So allocating things on a per capita basis makes sense in some way. Some people would argue that this is fair. Not necessarily if you do this on a European scale, for instance, and you would give everybody an equal share of the emission permits. Essentially what you're saying is that the people who live in Norway, where distances are large and therefore they need to drive a lot and winters are very cold, so they need a lot of energy, would get the same. They need a lot of energy and therefore they emit more CO2. Get the same permits, same amount of permits as people who live in Spain, where distances are shorter and winter are not nearly as bitter. Therefore they need less CO2. And essentially if you then give Norwegians and Spaniards the same amount of emission permits, essentially you're punishing relatively the Norwegians for choices that their ancestors made rather than themselves. So even though it sounds fair, it is not necessarily fair. It is a very easy thing to do because you don't need to sort out who is whom, and if somebody's more worthy than not, no, you just hand it out on a per capita basis. It's politically feasible, probably. California almost did this, not quite. They introduced the carbon cap and trade system for CO2, and there was a proposal to actually allocate those permits to the people equal per capita. Just didn't make it through the legislature. But it is a reasonable proposal. On a global scale, you would immediately run into the same problem as allocating the permits to the victims, because you would generate large transfers of money, because most of the permits would go to where most of the people are, and that is in countries that are far away. So on a global scale, this is a political non-starter. Now, the initial allocation is important as a distributional question, but it doesn't matter for the market. And that follows from the cost theorem. And you recall the cost theorem from last term. So here we have a simple cost-benefit diagram with price on one axis, quantity on the other axis. These are the costs of emission reduction. If we push emissions to zero, the costs of emission reduction are high. If emissions are high, then the cost of emission reduction is low. Emissions are high, then the benefits of emission reduction are high, but if emissions are low, then the benefits of emission reduction are low. So these curves behave something like that, and then we have this optimum that we want either to impose a tax P star or impose a quantity Q star. That is the optimal regulation. Now the cost theorem, recall, says it doesn't matter whether we start with a right to a pristine environment. Essentially, the polluter needs to compensate the pollutee, then because this brown curve then essentially becomes the demand curve, the willingness to compensate the pollutee. This is the demand curve of the polluter, and this is the supply curve of the pollutee, and the two end up here. Alternatively, you could say, well, there is initially a right to pollute, and then this curve becomes a willingness to pay demand curve from the pollutee to pay money to the polluter to pollute less. And then this becomes a supply curve of emission reduction. And again, the market would find this particular point here. So the cost theorem would suggest that actually the initial allocation doesn't matter. Another way of saying that is that cost theorem separates efficiency and equity, where efficiency is what does the market do, and equity says what is the initial allocation of permits. And the cost theorem predicts that under certain assumptions, regardless of the initial allocation of property rights, the market will find the same allocation. And the initial allocation then essentially determines who pays what. After emissions have been traded, the final allocation of the permit says who does what, who actually does the emission reduction, whereas the initial allocation is only about who pays for that emission reduction. This is of course terribly important politically, but it does not really affect how the market operates. So the initial allocation of permits is important for the distributional question of who pays for emission reduction, rather than for the question what will it cost and who will do what.